How do you decide what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for? Here's a reality. Some of you are taking way more responsibility than you should for other people and other people's problems. As a result, they don't have problems. You have a problem. Meaning you make their problems your problem, and now they don't have a problem because it's yours. Others of you, you don't take responsibility. You don't take responsibility for the things you should take responsibility for. And so, hey, I'm just calling you out today. Hey, we're ending a series about won't you be my neighbor? And an obvious question you may be wrestling with as you've gone through this series is like, okay, in a really practical way, like how much do I love my neighbor? Do others have to help me? If I've got to help somebody who's hurting and get involved in their life, if I've got to be both personal and practical in caring for others, I mean, what if I do that, but it leads to burnout in my life? What if I'm giving and giving, but I'm doing it at the expense of paying my own rent or my own mortgage? Like, at what point I'm responsible for myself and you're responsible for yourself? Hey, that's the question we're tackling today, and I think it's a real one. It's a big one. In fact, this question bleeds into not just our faith practice, but it bleeds into everyday practice, which obviously we bring our faith into every aspect of our life. It has roots in our view of politics and community service, how we interact with people in the workplace, how we handle our own children and parents, our family. Because when you start thinking about what you are and are not responsible for, you're making decisions about yourself and others. And so, since we're talking about neighbors throughout this series, I've shared stories about my own interactions with my neighbors. And so I thought I would jump right back in there. I have one of my neighbors, they were very reclusive. And so they built, an Alcatraz-size fence. Not just around their property, but they had a deck, and they put like an 8-foot fence on their deck. Now, I've never seen that before. They wanted no one in, and the feeling was like they didn't want anyone out. It was a little strange. There was not even a gate on the fence in their property. I'm not even sure that was safe. On the other hand, I've had plenty of neighbors where their dogs got in our yard, and I'll tell you why, because we didn't have a fence at that one place. We didn't have a fence, so their dog would run through the yard. Their dogs would leave a mess on my yard, and I had to clean it up and then talk to my neighbor. The house we have now, we have a fence, but we've had the dogs get in and leave a mess. And so, I get frustrated about that. And so the question is, how high are the fences that you've built in your life? Do you build Alcatraz-size fences around every aspect of your life and no one can get in and nothing can get out? Do you have no fences so that you're endlessly cleaning up other people's messes because they're leaving their mess in your yard and then you got to clean it up? Or have you built healthy fences? Sometimes things get in that don't belong there and you got to clean it up. And if there's a healthy fence, there's a gate or two. And when there's a gate, you can control what comes in and what goes out. I have had plenty of neighbors throughout my life, our life as a family. And I was thinking about the one family. We were trying to actually kind of be gracious with this family who had the Alcatraz fence even around their deck. And so, one winter, there was a big snow, and I would always go out and try to shovel our yard, our sidewalk, our little parking spot. I'd sometimes try to shovel other neighbors' spots. And so, their spot was right next to ours. And so I went out there and I cleaned off their car and their spot. And the guy came out screaming at me, "Don't touch my car." I get it, maybe if you're really particular, and he had the right to say, "Keep your hands off my car." Now, you can't do that while putting a pickaxe in my face, right? Because now you're getting into my space. On the flip side, I've also tried to help serve other neighbors. One of my neighbors, I told the story, they plugged their extension cord into my house, right? And then their comment was, well, you're a pastor, right? And so the question is like, right, because I love Jesus, should I just let anyone take power that I'm paying for from my house? Do I have the right and the responsibility to unplug it and say, no, you're responsible for your own power? And how do you decide? How do you know? I had a neighbor whose spouse was in drug rehab. And so I decided to mow the lawn for her during that season to help out. Was I responsible to do that? Did I have to do that? Or was I just being kind? Right? These are reasonable questions, because what happens is if we take too much responsibility for others' lives, it's usually feeding a need to be needed, and we get exhausted and we get burned out. On the other hand, if we don't look out for anyone, are we fulfilling the teaching of Jesus to love your neighbor? And then what about ourselves? If I'm doing so much for others and I get burned out and worn out, what am I responsible for when it comes to me? And so I'm going to bring you into the letter written by the Apostle Paul in Galatians. I've been teaching from the story, from the life and teachings of Jesus. And the Apostle Paul is referencing Jesus' teaching on love your neighbor. But in order to get there, I got to kind of just set the stage here, because the letter of Galatians is written to churches that the Apostle Paul started in the region of Galatia, where he went in, he made 2 different trips there. He was preaching, he was starting these churches. People came into the church. Well, after the Apostle Paul got these churches started, other Christian missionaries showed up, but they did not come from a Jewish background. They came from pagan backgrounds, and they thought the gospel's too easy. The message of Jesus is too easy, and if we don't give them rules to follow, and all they have to do is just believe in Jesus, they'll act lawlessly. They'll act badly. And so these new missionaries are coming in and telling them that they had to follow very strict religious laws in order to do right and get to heaven. And the Apostle Paul wrote this letter to say, no. What you need is Jesus. And so he's teaching them that what it means to be people who believe in Jesus, who believe in the way of Jesus, have the Spirit of Jesus in them, and as a result are spiritual. And so as he writes, this is later in his letter to the Galatian church, he gets to Galatians chapter 5, which talks about what it means to have the Spirit of Jesus in you. And then when he gets to chapter 6, he makes this really practical. He goes, you know what? You're going to see people who you see them doing wrong things. They're sinning against God and they're sinning against someone else. He goes, you can call them out, or you could ignore them, or you could help them get restored to the right way to live in relationship with God. And so he challenges in a very practical way what it means when you see someone doing the wrong thing. And then he continues in verse 2 saying this. So the context is, you see somebody doing something sinful, you try to restore them. And then he makes another practical point. Carry each other's burdens. Maybe some of the burdens are life-controlling sins. Maybe others are a very overwhelming and difficult life. He goes, but in this way, in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Well, what is this law of Christ that the Apostle Paul is writing about? He's writing about the law of love that Jesus taught. Where do we read about what Jesus taught? If you go back to the Gospel of Matthew, which we've taught during this sermon series, in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 through 40, Jesus is being questioned about if you could find a way to summarize the ancient laws of God as captured in the Torah, the first 5 books, and the prophets, what is being preached to the nation of Israel. How would you summarize all of those 613 laws. And Jesus says, let me give it to you. Let me give you the first one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul. And he goes, this is the first and the greatest commandment. In essence, love God. He goes, but let me give you the second one. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. And so the law of Christ is to love God and love your neighbor. And so the Apostle Paul is picking up on this teaching of Jesus and saying, here's the thing. This is practical and this is very real in your life because you are responsible. You need to recognize that you care for people in practical ways. You live out the law of Christ by carrying others' burdens. But then he continues and he qualifies it with this next verse. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. He goes, hold up, wait. Before you start taking too much responsibility for what others are doing, don't think too much of yourself, because if you do, you'll deceive yourself. And what's his point? He goes, here's what happens. If people think too much of themselves, motivated by pride or arrogance or a need to be needed, they do one of two things that are extreme. They take more responsibility for other people's lives than they should because they believe that they are able to solve the problems of the world. And, they've got it all figured out. They've got it all right. Some of you have a little bit of that in you. It's not just a need to be needed, but you think you got it figured out. And so you kind of stick your nose into others' problems and you make it your problem. On the flip side, others, because they think too much of themselves, they don't take responsibility for anybody else. They think the world exists to serve them because they think so much of themselves, they're only thinking about themselves. And so the Apostle Paul cautions with this verse. If you jump ahead a few verses, he gets to verse 7. He goes, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. And so he's making this kind of not concluding point, but this key point that everything you do is like a seed. When you take good care of yourself and you're healthy, that's a seed into your future. It produces fruit. When you take too much responsibility for others, that's a seed that you plant and it produces fruit. When you learn how to love others well, that's a seed. God cannot be mocked. A man will reap what he sows. And so there's a lesson in the Apostle Paul's teaching about how to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the key is this. It's really about fences. It's about, you've heard that good fences create good neighbors, right? This idea of like good fences, good neighbors. And so what's the lesson here? The idea of fences is this idea around boundaries, where your life, what are you responsible for? What's your property? The fences or the property line is where your life ends and someone else's life begins, right? And then outside of your property this is beyond my responsibility. And so really it's about having healthy life boundaries. So there's a lesson here. Developing healthy boundaries means taking appropriate responsibility. What does it mean to take appropriate responsibility? And I hope what you discover is that spiritual growth and spiritual maturity produces greater responsibility. Spiritual maturity produces greater responsibility. And there's a lesson in life. The more you grow and earn trust, the healthier boundaries become. And in essence, the more boundaries you're allowed to establish. Now, my boys would love to have big, high fences in their life between them and us. My boys would love to be able to just do what they want without mommy and daddy telling them no. A couple of my boys, we don't let them go off by themselves, even in our house, because we know that things will start breaking. They will climb things and get into things that they shouldn't. And so we make sure doors are open. We know where they are at all times. Why? Because they can't be trusted. Now, over time, as they get more responsible, they get more trust, which is a boundary, right? We'll let them close the door. We don't let them on phones or computers alone, hardly at all to begin with, but certainly not alone, not without supervision. Why? Because that is earned. So somehow trust and boundaries go hand in hand. The problem is you and I in life, we want trust and freedom without responsibility. And in fact, we pushed against God. And this gets us in trouble. You know what sin is? Sin is, God, I don't want you involved in my life. In fact, sin will take you all the way to the point where you say, God doesn't even exist. Certainly, God doesn't exist in my life. I can do what I want, meaning I have all the freedom I want, and I don't want accountability, I don't want responsibility, and I want God telling me how to live this out. And so the challenge we have is that we push back against God and God's best, and we live life our way. And you know what it leads to? It leads to, like, if the boys have unaccountable freedom to do what they want. And they'll always get themselves in trouble. You notice that when you give kids lots of freedom, they don't just go mow the lawn and do right things. They destroy things. They break things. They eat things they shouldn't. They watch things they shouldn't. They go places they shouldn't. They view things they shouldn't, right? Like the instinct in every one of us is the moment we get more freedom than we've earned, we do things we shouldn't have. And that's a sin instinct that sabotages us, pushing us away from God toward what feels good but will destroy us. Because we all have desires that go contrary to God and God's best, and those desires deceive us into believing that what feels good is good, and then it leads to our own ruin and our forever ruin. So now I got to bring you back into the passage in Galatians where the Apostle Paul is teaching what it looks like to live as spiritual beings. And the only way you become spiritual beings is to have God's Spirit in you. Well, how do you have God's Spirit in you? Thought you would never ask. Here's what God did. I read in verse 2, he says, carry each other's burden, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. I talk about this idea of sin. Sin becomes an unbearable burden. That's what the Apostle Paul was talking about in verse 1. Well, you and I, because of sin, deserve death and eternal judgment. It's an impossible burden to carry. So you know what God did? God intervened because of the law of Christ, loving us. See, God doesn't command love. He gives love and then invites us to love. And so he loves us, and Jesus came to rescue us and lift the burden of sin off of us. How did he do that? By coming, not just teaching and loving, but in love, dying on the cross to pay the penalty for our sin, absorbing our sin judgment, in essence, lifting the burden of sin off of us by putting it on himself and taking the full weight of that burden as a blow of death and eternal judgment on himself, dying in our place. But in death, giving us victory through the power of his resurrection, so that when you believe in Jesus by faith, you are forgiven of sin, the weight and burden of sin lifted off of you, and you're given new life and forever life. How are you given new life? Well, when you believe in Jesus, God's eternal invisible spirit comes and lives inside of your eternal invisible spirit. And when God's Spirit lives in your spirit, you have new life and forever life, and you have a transformed life. With God's Spirit in you, now God's Spirit guides you. And when you are led by God's Spirit, you become a spiritual being. That's what the Apostle Paul is talking about in Galatians chapter 5, what it looks like to be spiritual. And then he gives these challenges in a very practical way. So let's go back and read the concluding verse of his thought process here in verse 10, where he says, therefore, in light of everything I've shared, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So he's wrapping up his thought. He's saying, bear the burdens of others, fulfill the law of Christ, don't think too highly of yourself. Now here's the conclusion. We should do good to all people, especially looking out for people who believe in and follow Jesus. Now, let's take that idea and let's apply it practically so that you can when you finish this sermon, you go, I get what Patrick is saying, and I can put this into practice today. The first key part that I really want to give you is this. Let's read verses 4 and 5. He goes, therefore, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. Well, actually, I think I read, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. There's a lot here. The Apostle Paul is giving you an important nugget. And he starts with kind of the why. You and I should test our actions. Look at your life. Examine the behaviors of your life to determine why you're doing what you do. Then you can, and the word pride here is not like the sin pride, but you can be proud of, or you can find satisfaction. You can find fulfillment in your life alone without comparing yourselves with others. Meaning, you don't determine what you're responsible for by comparing yourself with others and saying, I need to be more like them, or I need to be like them. No, what has God given you responsibility for? And then he concludes that thought process with this. Each one should carry their own load. So what is the point here? Taking responsibility, which is how you establish healthy boundaries. Taking responsibility means knowing what's yours to carry. What is your load? And so now we got to just talk through that. Let me make this very practical for you. The idea of carry your load, in this context, the Apostle Paul is talking about this idea of you're going on a day trip. You have a job to do for the day, and you're gonna take a trip just for the day. You're gonna be back home at night. What do you bring with you? Basically, like when you go to work, what do you bring? Well, hopefully you probably bring your backpack or computer, your work stuff, right? Some of you, if you're in construction or you're doing manual labor, you have a toolbox that you bring. That's your load. You're responsible to bring your own tools and your own toolbox. I'm responsible to carry my own backpack. I probably bring a lunch with me. I know some of you, you're not being very healthy. You're not bringing your lunch. Look, I'm not responsible to bring your lunch. I'm responsible to bring my lunch. Now, I have the benefit of having an amazing wife who makes sure I don't get out the door without my lunch. But at the end of the day, I'm responsible for my own lunch. So that's what the Apostle Paul's talking about. He goes, your load is kind of like the backpack that you carry for a one-day journey. And each of you are responsible for that. So in essence, here's the key word. When you think about what am I supposed to take responsibility for, this is the fence line around your own property. And what the Apostle Paul is saying is you are responsible for your own yard. You're responsible for your own house. There's a great book called High Road Leadership by John Maxwell. And he's talking about this idea that there are low road people who believe that everyone else exists to give to them. They don't give to anyone else, they only take. And they expect others to serve them and give to them, and they feel entitled. It's one of the great dangers in America today. It's my yard, and it's my house, but you should mow it, you should clean it up, you should clean my house, and you should pay my rent or my mortgage, right? And people don't take appropriate responsibility for their own life. So let me make this very practical for you, because so far I'm using metaphors like fences and yards and property. But what does Scripture mean about carrying your own load? You are responsible for your own emotional well-being. No one else is responsible, right? So we've been taught to say things like, don't say, you made me mad. Right? Because you're saying it's your responsibility that I got mad. No, the appropriate thing to say is, when you slammed the door in my face, I got mad. You see the difference? I'm acknowledging that your action produced this reaction in me, but I am responsible for my own emotions. You are responsible for your emotional well-being. You are also responsible for your own emotional responses and controlling them, which means you do not biblically have the freedom of emotional impulse. You don't just get to react however you want to react and blame it on your emotions. You're responsible for your emotions and to control your emotions. And if things are not healthy, you're responsible to monitor that and get the help you need, get the support you need in order to regulate and get back to a healthy place. You're responsible for your physical and health well-being. Take care of yourself. Get adequate sleep. Exercise. Be healthy. Take good responsibility for your well-being. And sometimes we do that for others, right? Like I'm running a lot and I work out a lot. I'll tell you what motivates me. It's because I got 3 little boys that are gonna beat me up if I don't, right? Like now, that's kind of it. But really, actually, I'm looking ahead and I don't wanna be like an old dad who can't do anything, right? I'm thinking ahead, 10, 15 years and I wanna be able to, keep up with my boys and play. Now, if something happens, I can't, oh well, but I'm gonna give my best to be physically healthy so that I can do my part. So I'm responsible for my emotional well-being, my physical and health well-being. I'm responsible for my spiritual well-being. The church is not responsible for your spiritual well-being. Some people who have maybe they don't feel like they're in a healthy place spiritually and they blame the church. The sermon's not good enough, or the people don't care about me enough, or I didn't get a phone call when I wasn't there. Look, we want to do our part, but you are responsible for your own spiritual well-being. You can pray, you can open up the Bible, and you can study it just like I do. You can fast, you can seek God, you can ask others for prayer. You can meet with others to study the Bible together. You can get into a life group and encourage each other. You see, you're responsible for your own spiritual well-being. You're responsible for your family and your relationships. You're responsible to tend to your marriage and your children. It's on you to do what God's given you to do. You're responsible to work and to be financially healthy, right? Like, now, I know that I'm being quick here. Part of this is because we could do a whole sermon on each one of these issues, and at times I have. But what I'm saying in this one is like, recognize what's in your yard and say, I'm responsible. I'm responsible for my finances, for making good decisions. I think there's a lot of people in our culture today who they think that they can buy whatever they want to buy, get themselves in as much debt as they want, and then make their debt someone else's problem. And I'm just saying that how I spend my money and how I earn my money is the responsibility God has given me. And the more responsibility you take for yourself, the higher your dignity level. See, here's the challenge. When we don't take responsibility for ourselves, we're believing a lie that I am not able, and God hasn't given me the gifts or the capacity to care for my emotions, my physical well-being, my mind or my thinking. I'm not capable of taking care of my relationships or my finances. No, God has given you everything you need for life and liberty. And so you and I need to walk in that freedom. And we've got to be careful that we don't put the responsibility of our life on someone else. I mentioned about this idea of low road people that, they're only out to get and not give. There are mid-road level people, according to Maxwell, who they only give what they get. Then there are high road people who just want to serve and give and love others. The Apostle Paul talks about those kind of people. He says this in verse 2, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So there's clearly some line where we take responsibility by carrying our own load, and then we recognize that there is this other responsibility. Verses 9 through 10 reads this way, let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good for all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. He goes, you can get tired when you're taking responsibility both for your own life and then you see others in need and you're trying to help them. So what's the key here? The key is taking responsibility means knowing what's yours to share. Recognizing that God has, because of God's love in my life, God's goal is to give you more than enough. what fills, spills, right? Meaning God is pouring so much into your life that he wants to pour it through your life. The truth is, there are people who are generous and loving and helpful and serving, and they don't believe in God. Faith isn't what motivates them. But what I have found is, if you believe in God, it should be impossible not to be loving and gracious, compassionate, servant-hearted, and generous toward others. You see, there are people who do it without that. But I don't think you can believe in God and have a deep faith in Jesus and not be that way. Why? Because what fills, spills. And so you both take responsibility by recognizing what is yours to take care of, what you're load to carry, and by recognizing what is yours to share. This is not chronic. This means I am not perpetually taking care of other people's needs and other people's demands. Make sure that you're not being motivated because you're being manipulated. You have to do this for me. You owe me this. No, I'm willing to help, but I'm not going to help you chronically. Why? Because otherwise people become dependent on us, and they become codependent on us meeting their needs. In fact, the whole idea of parenting is to slowly hand off responsibility from parents to children, including their own faith responsibility, right? We're handing over responsibility over time so that eventually they become independent and capable adults. And so we don't want our kids to become codependent on us, where they need us and they can't define themselves without us. So you have to watch out for that. But this idea of when the Apostle Paul says, carry the burdens of others, the word actually is boulder, meaning there are things that are more than a load. It's more than your daily responsibility. There are boulders that fall onto people's lives. Now, sometimes they land in their emotions. It's from trauma in their childhood or trauma in experience. Sometimes that boulder lands in their physical health. They have a health crisis. Sometimes that boulder lands in their mental health, and it becomes mental illness, or it lands in their finances or in relationships. And what that means is there is something that on your own you cannot move. And others around recognize that that is a boulder that it requires help to move. That's why you get into counseling. That's why you talk to pastors. That's why you seek financial help or counsel, assistance, right? And you and I, as people who follow Jesus, have a responsibility to recognize and look for boulders in others' lives. Our responsibility is not to avoid it when we see it and go, that's not my problem. Actually, if God is filling your life, something should spill from your life, and somewhere there is a boulder that you can help assist in moving. Boulders are the impossible things for someone to carry on their own. And so it's okay to mow someone else's yard. You don't have to do it forever. You can maybe do it for a season, maybe do it once. It's okay to clean off someone's car if they want you to. But I don't have to allow someone to plug their stuff into my house and steal my electricity. You see the difference? I can invite them to. I can say, hey, I'm going to let you do this, but you don't have the right to take it from me. And so I recognize what's mine to share. And then I offer it for a season without people abusing or taking advantage of. And when someone abuses or takes advantage of, I cut off access to my sharing, because it's now no longer sharing, it's taking. And so I want to be able to give without it being demanded of me. Now, if it is demanded, Jesus certainly teaches that we can give, go above and beyond the obligation, go above and beyond the demand, because we want to show the generosity of God. But that does not mean you continue to expose yourself to abuse or people taking advantage of you. You move on to the next situation. So I've laid out for you in very practical terms what it looks like and means for you to take full responsibility by establishing healthy boundaries in your life. You're responsible to carry your own load and to recognize what's yours to share so that you can serve and help others. You can be a support and a resource. What fills, spills. But I said that, this is really hard without faith in Jesus. At the end of the day, How are you doing? What does the yard of your life look like? I know for you and I that there's probably some things that have grown up on our property that we didn't want to be there because of sin. And so at the end of the day, this message must come back to, are you in a right place with God? Has Jesus lifted the burden of sin off of your life? And if not, today is a day for you to begin brand new and fresh by allowing God to lift sin, lift guilt, lift shame off of you, and make you a brand new person so he can fill your life with his love, his forgiveness, and the promise of heaven. And if that's where you're at today, I want to invite you to make that commitment, that decision. In fact, across our campuses, would you close your eyes for a moment? And if you're ready to say yes to Jesus by faith, I want to invite you to raise your hand high and say, hey, that's me. I'm ready to say yes to Jesus. I'm ready to believe in Jesus. And all you can do is believe and receive. And if you're making that commitment and you're going to raise your hand high and say, yes, Patrick, that's me. What we want to do is I want to pray with you, and we want to put a card in your hand. When you receive that card, please fill it out. Drop it in the giving boxes or bring it out to Next Steps so one of our pastors can follow up with you and encourage you as you begin this new journey in relationship with God. And so you are saying yes to Jesus. I want to take a moment and pray with you. But before I pray, and those of you that raised your hand, hopefully you kept your hand up long enough for us to put a card in your hand. I also want to pray for all of us that we would take adequate responsibility for our lives. And then recognize what God has poured into us so it'll pour through us. What's ours to share? Can I pray with you right now? Jesus, thank you for loving us so much that you gave your life to give us life. You took responsibility for our lives and our sin. And you've poured your love into us. And so right now we say thank you for those that are saying yes to Jesus. We're receiving They're receiving that new life, that forgiveness, and that forever life. And every one of us who have received when we believed, we know that what fills spills. And so we want to take right responsibility for our lives. And we also want to be responsible to share what you've given us to share. God, let us be good neighbors. In Jesus' name, amen.